later on. And now it's my pleasure to call on the chair of the day, Stephen Rando, to take over the meeting and more formally introduce today's guest speaker.
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to an extraordinary opportunity we have here today to explore the intriguing realm of forensic psychology, guided by none other than the eminent Tim Watson-Munro. With a career spanning an impressive 45 years, as discussed just over lunch, Mr. Watson-Munro has left an indelible mark on the field, having assessed over 30,000 individuals and lent his expert testimony in court over 3,000 times. I'll let Tim talk about his earlier days and his 25 years of age in starting at the infamous Parramatta Jail. Tim Watson has also held esteemed positions, such as the former national chairman of the College of Forensic Psychologists within the Australian Psychological Society. He's also served as a visiting fellow at Melbourne University and also a visiting professor at Bond University, and has contributed his expertise to various advisory boards at tertiary institutions. Prepare to be captivated, inspired, and informed as we embark on this riveting exploration of forensic psychology with the unparalleled Tim Watson-Munro. Everyone, give us a warm welcome for Tim.
Well, with an introduction like that, I hope you're not disappointed. Thank you for coming. 45 years is a lot to cover in 25 minutes. I worked out it's about 30 seconds per year, but I'll do my best and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So I remember the 14th of August 1978 very well. It was my first day on the tools at Parramatta Jail. I was 25 years of age and I was green as they came. I'd come from a fairly gentrified background. My father was a professor of physics at Sydney University. My mother was a musician and an artist. And I'd had a fairly privileged upbringing. So when I was offered this job, which I didn't think I'd get, my friends who knew me well said, look, don't do it. It'll change you irrevocably. You're a sensitive, creative guy. But the challenge was too much. I took the job and I arrived at Parramatta Jail on this day. And the thing that I remember immediately was the smell of Lysol, which is turbocharged Dettol. It's a disinfectant. It's permeated the air everywhere. And the wolf whistles. I was 25 and I looked about 18. So I received all these whistles. I was taken over to the governor of the jail's office, a bloke by the name of Harry Duff. And I remember his office. He had a portrait of the Queen, slightly askew, overused old leather chairs, and he was clearly a bloke who didn't mind a schooner or two. And he said to me, welcome aboard, son. The last psycho, as we were known, lasted 3 months. And we wish you well. And my voice wasn't as deep then. I said, thank you very much, Mr. Duff. And he said, I just want to give you another bit of advice and I'll keep the French down. But he said, remember this, if you can be conned, you can be screwed. And with that, I left his office and then negotiated a maze of gates to get to my office in the administration block. Now, I was very keen, so I'd arrived earlier than I should have, and there was a prison officer on the door. I was so keen to fit in, I didn't wear a suit. I wore a T-shirt and Levi jeans. The T-shirt was green. So I knocked on the door and I said, prison psycho. And he said, he's not here yet, you dog. Why don't you crawl back under the rock you came from? And I said, no, I'm the prison psycho. And you see, I realised that my green T-shirt was exactly the same T-shirt that the prisoners wore. So that was my introduction to the jail. He apologised profusely. I said, look, it's all good. I understand. Let's move on. So in the prison, back then, 46 years ago now, psychologists were a rarity, and there was a big cultural divide. There were prison officers known as screws, and there were prisoners known as crims, and then somewhere in no man's land were people like me who were just damn do-gooders and shouldn't be in the jail. So I had my work cut out for me. I had to establish rapport with the prison officers, because I realised very quickly without their input and support I'd be like the last guy who ran out pulling his hair 3 months after he started the job. So it was very hard to get prisoners to trust you. But with me, I was lucky. I had one who came to see me, and back in that day, I used to smoke. Very occasionally, I had Benson Hedges extra mild in my top pocket, and he could see the top gold of the packet. And I could see he was coveting a cigarette, because in jails, all they had was White Ox, which was, straight from the barn, basically. And I said, would you like a cigarette? He said, oh, I'd love a cigarette. I gave him one. And then he was looking at the Moccona coffee. And I said, would you like some proper coffee? Because they had Gibson's issue coffee, all low budget stuff. So we had a bit of a chat, shook hands. The next day, 5 blokes turned up, because the word had got out that if you go and see the psycho, you'll get a free cigarette and a cup of coffee. So at the end of the week, I had 20 regular clients. They were all turning up, and I think the prison officers looked with some amusement and thought, well, maybe. The next thing I did was I became involved in a number of prison programs, and it was very easy, ironically, paradoxically, to do it in Parramatta Jail, because it was a multi-recidivist maximum security jail, which meant that people were not going anywhere. It was an end-of-the-line jail for these people. And because of that, you could set up programs confident in the knowledge that they wouldn't be moved somewhere else in the middle of the night, because there was nowhere else to take them. So I became involved in a program known as the Parramatta Recidivist Group, and it involved a group of 4 prisoners who were trained in counselling, and we set up what was ultimately proved to be a very successful crime deterrent scheme, where juvenile offenders were sent to jail for 1 day as an experiential learning process for them. The idea came from the Rahway State Prison in New Jersey. There was a program that they had called Scared Straight. Our program was better. Fear is a very short-term motivator. Experience, if you experience jail, we figured that people would be more likely to retain the lessons learned. So these guys came in, they were referred by the courts. It was the last option for them, and they would spend the morning as a prisoner, dressed in a prison uniform, meaningless prison tasks, polishing locks, doing that sort of stuff. And they would then be locked up in the afternoon for their lunch. And then following that, they would have the counselling session with the 4 prisoners, who would say, well, look, you're in today because you've been stealing cars. I'm now doing life for murder, but 20 years ago, I came to jail for stealing cars. And it proved to be very successful. Arising from that, we were invited to go on the Mike Walsh show. Never heard before, getting maximum security jail prisoners onto TV, but we had a reformist Corrective Services Commission, and so off we went to Channel 9. These guys, their outfits were sort of 20 years beforehand, so it was quite comical to see us all there. As it eventuated, Mike Walsh was sick, and we had Jimmy Hannon. Does anyone remember Jimmy Hannon? He was the guy with the radioactive teeth, and nobody had briefed him on who we were, what it was all about, because Mike had called in sick. So we prepared a little video, and he watched the video. It went out to the audience around Australia, and then it was me and 2 prisoners. One was doing life for murder. The other, Kevin Brown, was doing 25 years for a series of armed robberies. So he said, well, Ray, the murderer, why are you in jail? And he said, well, I'm ashamed, but I killed my wife, and so on. And then there was another guy, Arthur, and he was there for robbing banks. And then Jimmy looked at me and he said, and Tim, why are you in jail? And I said, well, I'm the prison psychologist, Jimmy, and they cut to an ad break. But out of that program, we got a lot of publicity, a lot of public support. The other couple of programs I set up was the first drug rehab program in any jail in New South Wales, and that worked pretty successfully. And the other one was the concert committee. It was the International Year of the Child, and there was a guy by the name of George Crawford. He was placed in charge of this program, and we persuaded all the major rock and roll acts of the day to come into the jail on consecutive Sundays to perform for the prisoners and to record the sessions and then to create an album, an LP album, as they were back then, which was called Canned Rock. And all the proceeds from the royalties which they donated went to the International Year of the Child. So what did I learn out of all this? That people, no matter what their circumstances, whatever they may have done, and a lot of the people there had done very bad things, there's always potential there. There's always some talent, and if you can dig into that talent, it's very worthwhile. Arising from the Day in Jail program, I was invited to give a paper in Melbourne on the program, and it was through that process that I met the now late Dr. David Syme. He was an eminent forensic psychiatrist in Melbourne, and he said, you should come and work with me. And I said, look, I'm really flattered, but you have to understand I live in Balmain, and that was an important thing for me. I lived between two hotels and I had a good quality of life. But he started referring me work, and, you know, greed is good, would say. I came down for a weekend and I said, look, I've enjoyed this. I'll come down for a year. We'll see how we go. Well, that was October 1981. So that started my career in private practice. In order to establish myself here, I took on an academic position at Phillip Institute, now RMIT, and through RMIT I met a number of senior police who were doing the degree there, and I then became involved in assisting the police with profiling and dealing with stress and lecturing at detective training school. So all the time building up the practice, building up the profile and so on. I think the big break came was 1987, so about 6 years later. I was retained to assess Julian Knight. Julian Knight had committed the Hoddle Street atrocity, and they wanted to have a psychological workup on him as well as a psychiatric one. And I spent about a year with Knight. There was no mental state defence, but that raised my profile even further and the work kept coming in. And it just went from there. Other big cases followed. Alan Bond was referred to me. I spent a bit of time in Perth assessing his brain and his memory. It was quite controversial at the time, and a few other big cases as well, including a number of the now deceased notorious gangland figures, people like Alphonse Gangitano, the Moran brothers. There was a whole gaggle of them, and I looked back and I realised that with the underworld war, in excess of 20 of my clients had been murdered during that time. So they were pretty rough and ready days. During that time I married and had at that stage 2 children. And, you know, I think, you know, the next lesson, if I can give a lesson, is the importance of not burning out, because I had raging burnout and depression. I was working 100 hours a week. You know, I was just juggling my life in a crazy way. And so I fell into a very deep depressive illness. And attendant to that, you know, I developed a problem with cocaine. It was well publicised at the time. and I got into a fair bit of strife with the registration board. I lost my ticket for a number of years, and it was during that time that I thought you've really got to take stock of your life, and if you get back into practice, you've got to make sure you don't repeat those errors of overwork and hubris and ego and all the rest of it. So when all that happened, I was offered a position at Bond University as an adjunct visiting professor, which I was very grateful to take. I went into recovery, I had treatment for the depression, and I got back into business in about, well, just on 20 years ago now, 2004. I started getting work from Sydney, where I came from originally, and again, you know, the big cases came in. So I had a number of the first terrorists referred to me. One guy in particular, Lodi, was the first person charged under the retrospective anti-terrorism laws in Australia, brought in by John Howard. And he was an interesting character. He was an architect. He lived in the suburbs. He had a highly qualified wife. And he was caught, you may recall back then, there were a lot of ads about if you notice anything suspicious, if you leave a bag, you see a bag unattended, call this number. Well, thank goodness for everyone, someone noticed some strange things going on, and they contacted the police, and he was charged with very serious acts of terrorism. He actually hadn't committed them, but he had the intention to, you know, blow up people, basically. I had a number of the major bikies referred to me. There was a murder at Sydney Airport, this internecine dispute between the Comancheros and the Hells Angels. Mick Howie, who was the national president of the Comancheros, was referred to me. He was charged with murder. It was reduced on appeal, and eventually it was just, you know, assault occasioning grievous bodily harm because he didn't swim the bollard. But I realised that, you know, I was starting to get immersed again, working too much, and I started to pull back from those sorts of clients. In the interim period, as was mentioned by Stephen, I was appointed the national chairman of the College of Forensic Psychologists. I did that for a number of years. I was involved in establishing the first doctorate in forensic psychology at Melbourne University. I was on an advisory board, and then I lectured those students in the assessment of offenders. And then, as I mentioned, after my nadir, I was offered a position at Bond University, and I sat on advisory boards there and at Melbourne University. So I've always tried to mix it up a bit with academic involvement and practical work. Most recently, I've been tapping into that creativity that probably, I don't know where it came from, but so I've written a couple of books. They were both bestsellers. One was Dancing with Demons. The other was titled A Shrink in the Clink, and it looked at all sorts of different cases and so on. I've done a number of documentaries. I've formed an alliance with Dr. Xanth Mallet, who you probably see regularly on morning TV. She's an associate professor of criminology at the University of Newcastle, and we worked on a 4-hour documentary on Ivan Milat called Buried Secrets. I've done a number of others looking inside the mind of killers, and I do quite a bit of media stuff. I've got another book in train looking at, and I think it's obviously very topical at the moment, Why Men Hurt Women. I mean, it's a national disgrace that we have, last year I think 56 women were killed by males that they know, either partners or estranged partners and so on. So I'm working on that. And Xanth and I have also done a podcast series together. It's called Motive and Method. We completed series 2 at the end of last year. I'm very proud to say we got to number 5 on Spotify. And so I now have much more balance in my life than I had back then. I'm getting older, clearly. More family time. Now 5 adult children. grandchild, another one on the way. And in the wake of COVID, I relocated to Byron Bay. And so I was spared the traumas associated with lockdown in Melbourne. I had a daughter living in New York, and I got her out of there. I said, we can fight about it next week, but you're on a plane tomorrow. And she came and she lived with me up there for a couple of years. So what have I learned through all of this? I mean, yes, thousands, 30,000 plus clients in court all the time. I've learned that, for me, I always look for the good in people. I try and encourage people to do better. I try not to be judgmental. Having been through the mill myself, I know what that's all about. And it's so important picking up on the professor's talk about looking after yourself. The psychosocial health, I think, is going to be the next big thing globally. That we can do a lot in the preventive sphere if we take care earlier on in our lives and so on. So I just want to double check all my notes, and I think I'm pretty much on time. Yes. So I guess in closing, I've had a great life. It's had the ups and downs. I've had the privilege of experiencing things that people only read about or avoid, but I've met a very interesting spectrum of human beings along the way. People say I should now sort of look at semi-retirement, but we were talking about it at lunch. I have this firm view, for me, that to stay physically active, you have to keep your brain mentally active. You have to have things to do. You have to have purpose in life. And of course, you have to be mindful of your age too and not overdo it. So regular walks, music, kids and work is the right balance for me. So I think we're right on time. Thank you for listening. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Tim. I'm just going to ask a few questions from the audience.
Yes, now it's question time. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of it. If you look at the research, you look at those cases, often these memories have been retrieved through hypnosis. The people who are hypnotised are highly suggestible. And the cases you referred to, which I think are the ones I've looked at, rightly so, should have been thrown out. It's been tried in Australia, but, it's vigorously challenged in court, as it should be. Now, I'm not saying that people don't have traumatic memories and they're repressed, but the process of extracting that, it's so vulnerable to manipulation and suggestion, I don't think it should be taken terribly seriously. Yes. The person with the... Oh, okay, we'll start with you. Hi. In terms of the carers or the offenders? Oh, it's a very good question. I mean, I've been on a soapbox for decades about this in terms of prevention is better than cure, early education is better than locking up, and it starts at home. But the problem is quite a number of these people that you see in juvenile facilities come from very dysfunctional homes. It's also about education. I mean, I think beyond the 3 R's that kids learn in primary school, there should be classes on social skills training, conflict resolution, problem solving, those sorts of things. So I think that we need to start much earlier than we do. Much of the stuff that goes on in juvenile detention is reactive, not proactive. Now, that's not to say there's not programs there, they are there, but it's very difficult to get to square one with these people once they're institutionalised like that. The only thing I'd add to that, which I think is relevant, is just this escalating substance use issue we have globally and in Australia. I can remember when I started working, you rarely saw 18-year-olds in a jail like Parramatta Now you go to maximum security jails, you're seeing 18-year-olds charged with murder, and it's often, more often than not, a function of unbridled drug addiction, drugs like ice, evil stuff, which impacts on judgment, highly addictive, and they have no judgment. So the curve has straightened. It's almost like exponential, very straight. Yes. That person with the beard, just there, please. Oh, look, again, with respect to great question, there's all sorts of red flags, right, in relationships. Coercive control, toxic masculinity, they're names we throw around and labels we throw around, but it's really recognising the problem before you're part of the problem. I mean, most of these women that are killed are in or are attempting to leave abusive relationships. And the most dangerous time for a woman is when she actually tries to get out of that situation. These guys have glass jaws, they're entitled and big egos. One of the podcast episodes Xanth and I did was on Hannah Clark. For those who don't know the name, she was a woman who was set alight with her 3 children by her partner in Queensland. And all the red flags are there. We interviewed a number of other people. They all speak to the same thing. Coercive control, trying to keep people away from family, friends, isolating them. Why do you want to go out? You stay at home, controlling their money and so on. So it's multifactorial and very complex, but I don't think it's impossible to deal with, or at least reduce the number of killings we have. Our program was highly successful. It was researched by the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, and on a 2-year follow-up, 60% of the referrals, as we describe them, were not seen in a court again. And I think the difference is this, that, as I mentioned, ours was based on experiential learning. So when they were locked up over lunchtime, when they polished the locks, there was never any direct threat against them. When they were counselled by the 4 prisoners, it wasn't saying, look, if you come in here, you're going to be bashed and all the rest of it. It was just about, this is what life will be like for you in jail. You'll lose contact with your family. Obviously, there's sexual abuse that goes on and so on. But it wasn't the ham-fisted approach that they adopted at Railway State Prison. I think you can still get the documentary based on the Railway one. It's called Scared Straight. And you'll see what I mean if you watch it, about trying to scare people. Fear is a short-term motivator, as you would probably know from your esteemed career on the bench, But if people get the insight, if the switch goes, aha, I don't want to go down that path, it can be far more effective long-term. There we go.
With the juveniles across Australia, Tim, what is the solution, or what do you advise as to how do we stop that?
Well, I'd firstly say not all juveniles break the law, but for those that do, and it's clearly seems to be an escalating problem in terms of the lowering age of serious crime. So we have allegedly 4 people in Brisbane. One of them allegedly stabbed a 70-year-old grandmother over the weekend. We had an esteemed medical practitioner in Melbourne who was murdered the week before. Home invasion, car theft gone wrong. I have friends that have been subject to having their cars stolen at knife point in Melbourne. So there's no argument it's a growing problem. I think it gets back to better education. It was something I spoke about this morning on a podcast, accountability and responsibility of parenting. And, often the argument is, well, we can't do anything about our kids, or there's no consequences for these kids. And I suspect if you drill down in terms of their developmental history, there's never been boundaries or consequences established for them. So there's no simple solution to it. And, I would say that some people who commit, even juveniles who commit violent crimes, If they commit a further offence on bail, it should just be bail refused, no argument, because there's been a number of these cases where offenders have allegedly been on bail and then committed even more serious crimes. It's a complex issue. It's a good question.
I think we're all done. Yes, round of applause for Tim. Now, you will not be going empty-handed, Tim. We've got our 200% socks for you to keep you warm in the days of Byron Bay, but also your travels across still working. So again, on behalf of Rotary Melbourne, thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you. We'll compare colours. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Before we close, look, thanks to all visitors and guests for attending today. We'd also like to thank MC Rosemary Nixon and the Reflections of Peter Dakin for today, of our lunch setup and reception teams for their continued efforts. Just a special notice reminder, next week we will be having our evening picnic at the on Wednesday evening at Rotary Peace Park, an amazing night, so please come on down. I've got a special box as well that I'd like to share with the club as well for that evening. Also next week, on the Friday night, we've got the annual architectural walk guided by our very own club architect, Barbara. Where's Barbara? Have a chat with her after this. Again, a credible walk around Fitzroy by Barbara. Some spaces are still available, so please check the detail in the bulletin and please join us for these special events.